The Oregon coast does not welcome you. It watches you. 5 people, same stretch of coast, different years. None of them came back, and one man saw all of it. He wrote everything down. He never called anyone. He kept a record for 30 years. Then he died, and someone finally read it. Her name is Detective Sarah Okafor, and what she finds in those pages will not stay in those pages. She stood in the rain for 4 minutes before going inside. Detective Sarah Okafor would later check the parking lot camera. 4 minutes, 11 seconds. Not hesitation, something else. As if she was giving herself one last chance to turn around. She said, "My grandfather died 2 days ago." She said, "This is his. I brought it without reading it." She said nothing else for a long time. Sarah looked at the bag, then at the woman. Then she asked, "Why bring it here?" Lily Calloway's answer was 3 words. "I was afraid." The first entry was dated March 14th, 1991. The last entry was dated March 14th, 2021, 30 years to the day, same date, every year. Sarah did not yet know what that meant, but her hand, still resting on the desk, had stopped moving. The entry for March 14th, 1994 read, "She came at low tide, said she couldn't carry it anymore. I told her the sea was the only honest listener. She walked to the jetty. I watched the light. By morning, nothing." Sarah read it twice. Then she turned to page 2. 5 disappearances. Depot Bay, 1991 through 2003. All within a 2-mile radius of the lighthouse. All logged, none reported. Roy Calloway had watched every one of them and had told no one for 30 years. The question was not what he saw. The question was what he said to them before they went. 5 names, 5 dates, 5 entries in Roy Calloway's logbook. Each one written in the same calm, unhurried hand. No panic, no guilt that Sarah could yet identify. Just observation. The way a tide chart records water. She pulled the first missing persons file, opened it, and found Roy Calloway's name already inside, listed as a witness. Interviewed once. Case closed 11 days later. Every case, same pattern. A witness provides the final detail that closes the file. The witness is Roy Calloway. Each time, interviewed once. Each time, cooperative. Each time, the investigating officer signs off within 2 weeks. Sarah wrote 1 word in her notebook, underlined it twice. Convenient. She drove the route herself, 40 minutes from the cold case office to the Lighthouse Road. She stopped where each of the 5 had last been seen. Not because the evidence required it, because she needed to understand what they saw when they arrived here. What made them stay? What made them walk toward the water? Roy Calloway had lived here for 31 years, appointed 1970, retired, not by choice, 2001, when the lighthouse was automated. He refused to leave the cottage. The Coast Guard let him stay. No one recorded why. Perhaps because no one wanted to be the one to move a man like Roy Calloway out of the only place he had ever fully controlled. In the flashback light, he looks almost pastoral, a keeper, a man who tends a light so others don't get lost. But the figure outside the window, Roy doesn't call out, doesn't move toward the door, just writes date, time, tide level, and 1 sentence describing what the person outside had told him earlier that evening when they knocked on his door. He would later tell the investigating officer she seemed at peace, said she wanted to watch the sunrise from the jetty. "I didn't think anything of it." The officer wrote it down, closed the file 11 days later. Roy went back to his logbook, and on the next blank page started a new entry. Tom Briggs had been sheriff of this county from 1988 to 2009. He had overseen 3 of the 5 investigations personally. He had signed off on all 3. He poured Sarah a coffee she didn't ask for, set it between them like a boundary marker. Then he sat down and said, "Roy Calloway was a good man. Whatever you think you found, be careful what you do with it. Those people," he said slowly, "came to Roy because they had nowhere else to go. He listened to them, that's all." Sarah looked at her notepad, then looked up. "And after he listened, how many of them left the same way they arrived?" Tom Briggs picked up his coffee, didn't drink it, set it back down, said nothing. She thanked him for his time. He didn't stand up when she left. At the door, she stopped, didn't turn around. The first case, 1991. The report said the witness interview was conducted at the lighthouse. Tom Briggs: "That's right. The interview log shows 40 minutes. But the drive from town is 55. A long silence. You were already there. She left before he could answer. Tom Briggs had been at that lighthouse before Roy Calloway was ever interviewed, before the case was officially opened, before anyone had even confirmed there was a case to open. Sarah drove north. The lighthouse beam turned once, then again. The question she had started with, what did Roy say to them, had just grown a second shadow. What did Tom Briggs already know, and when did he know it? The cottage had been sealed 2 days after Roy Calloway's death, pending next of kin review. Lily had signed the access form that morning, hadn't asked what Sarah was looking for. Sarah didn't tell her, because she wasn't sure yet. She stood in the doorway of a dead man's life and let herself feel the weight of the room before she touched anything in it. He had marked the tides, not the dates of the disappearances. The title conditions on those dates, low tide, every single one. Sarah pulled out her phone, photographed the chart, then stood still for a moment and thought about what that meant. A man who cared less about when they came and more about whether the water would take them quietly. This is how it worked. They came to him first, not to the jetty, to the door. They knocked. He opened it. He made tea, or he didn't. He sat down, and he listened, for hours sometimes. Roy Calloway was, by every account of every person who ever met him, an exceptional listener. And somewhere in that listening, in the hours before the tide went out, he said something back. What he said is not in the logbook. The logbook records only what they told him, never what he told them. That omission had a shape. Sarah could feel it, like a room where the furniture has been arranged to hide a mark on the floor. 40 feet of rotting wood. That was the distance between Roy Calloway's window and the open water. She walked to the end, stood where they would have stood. The lighthouse beam passed overhead, slow, indifferent, and for 1/2 second the water below was illuminated, dark green, deep, and utterly without any sign that anything had ever happened here. He could see everything from that window, every step, every moment of hesitation. He watched them come to the end, and he never, not once in 30 years, walked down to the jetty after them, never called the Coast Guard, never called Tom Briggs. He just wrote it down. Date, tide, 1 sentence, and went to bed. That was the thing Sarah couldn't square, not the watching, the sleeping. His voice, when Sarah imagined it, and she had started to imagine it, which was a line she noticed herself crossing, was unhurried. The voice of a man who has thought about something for so long that thinking about it no longer costs him anything. The sea was here before the grief. It will be here after. I only pointed at it, what they did that was already in them when they knocked on my door. 4 of the 5 were confirmed voluntary. That was what the file said. That was what Tom Briggs had implied. That was, technically, not a crime. But Sarah had been doing this long enough to know that voluntary was the most dishonest word in a detective's vocabulary. Voluntary compared to what? Voluntary after what? Voluntary. Whose voice was the last one in your ear before you decided? She stared at the blank column. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote, he told them the sea was the only honest listener. Then she underlined it. Then she sat back and looked at the corkboard, at the 5th photograph, the one that was different, the one Roy had written about differently, not she seemed at peace, not he said he wanted to watch the sunrise. The 5th entry read only, this one didn't want to go. I couldn't let him leave. Sarah's pen hit the floor. She didn't pick it up. 4 came willingly. 1 didn't. 4 were grief. 1 was something Roy Calloway had decided to solve in his own way, on his own jetty, on a low tide in November 1998. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She pulled the 5th file, read the name on the cover, and understood for the first time why Lily Calloway had stood in the rain for 4 minutes before coming inside. The 5th disappearance. November 14th, 1998. The file was thin, thinner than the others. 3 pages where the others had 15. 1 witness interview, Roy Calloway. 1 signature on the closeout form, Tom Briggs. Timeline, 9 days from reported missing to case closed. The others had taken 11 days. Someone had been in a hurry. Sarah turned to the witness statement. Roy's handwriting, not typed, handwritten, filled exactly half a page. The other half was blank. The name on the file was David Okafor, 41 years old, Portland, marine surveyor. Reported missing by his wife, a woman named Grace, and their daughter, 9 years old at the time. Sarah set the folder on the desk. She did not drop it. She set it down with both hands, carefully, the way you set down something that has just become too heavy to hold standing up. Her father's name was David Okafor. He disappeared when she was 9. Her mother told her it was a storm, a Coast Guard report, an accident at sea. She had believed that for 30 years, the file in front of her had a different story. And Roy Calloway had been there to tell the first version of it to a sheriff who signed it closed in 9 days. Sarah sat in that room for a long time without turning on any more lights. She sat in the parking lot for 22 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock. The phone in her hand was warm from being held, but the call button stayed dark. What do you say to a woman who built 30 years of her life on a version of events that a logbook and a thin file have just quietly dismantled? Sarah put the phone in the cup holder, started the engine, drove north. She didn't call ahead, didn't want him to have the time a phone call gives you, the seconds to arrange your face, to decide what you already knew and what you're about to pretend you're hearing for the first time. She needed to see his eyes when she said the name, not his answer, his eyes. Before the answer, she said the name, just the name, nothing else. Tom Briggs's face did the thing she had driven 40 minutes to see, not guilt. She had expected guilt. What crossed his face was older than guilt. Guilt is about what you did. What crossed Tom Briggs's face was about what he had been every single day for 27 years since he signed that form. He stepped back, let her in, closed the door. "He called me," Tom said, "the night of. He called me first, before anyone reported anything." Sarah said nothing. Tom's hands tightened on the mug. He said the man had come to him distressed. That they'd talked. That the man had left, walked down toward the water. That Roy had tried to stop him. Tom looked up. "That's what he said, Sarah, and you believed him." "Tom, I wanted to. The others, I believed those. I did. People go to the coast when they're done. It happens. Roy was a place they found. A last conversation. I thought." He stopped, started again. "Your father's file was different. I knew it was different. Roy's statement had a gap in it. A gap I chose not to pull on." He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has just heard the sentence he has been rehearsing for decades, finally spoken out loud by someone else. She asked one question. Did my father go to that jetty because he wanted to, or because Roy Calloway made him believe it was the only place left to go? Tom Briggs opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know," he said. And Sarah Okafor, who had built a career on knowing when someone was lying, looked at Tom Briggs and understood that this, of everything he had said tonight, was the only thing that was completely true. Roy Calloway had died of natural causes, age 78, heart failure, in his bed, in his coat, in his boots. The logbook was the only thing he had prepared in advance, left on the table, not hidden, as if he had decided at the end that Lily, finding it, was not a mistake, but the last deliberate act of a man who had kept everything for 30 years and finally needed someone else to carry it. The question was whether that made him a confessor or a coward. She called from the car, not from inside. She needed the ability to drive away if the conversation required it. The phone rang 4 times. Grace Okafor answered on the 5th, the way she always had, as if she used the extra ring to prepare herself for whoever was calling and whatever they might need. Sarah, not a question, never a question, a declaration. "You are here, I am here, what is it?" She did not tell her mother what she had found. Not yet, not like this. She asked instead, "Mom, Dad's accident, the Coast Guard report. Did you ever read the full report? Or just the summary?" A silence on the line, not the silence of someone who doesn't understand the question. The silence of someone who has been waiting for that specific question for a very long time. Grace Okafor had never remarried, had never, as far as Sarah knew, spoken of David Okafor as anything other than a man taken by the sea in a storm he should have avoided. That was the version. That had always been the version. A marine surveyor, a storm, a Coast Guard report, the clean, closed shape of an accident. Sarah had never thought to pull on it until tonight. Her mother said, "I read what they gave me." A man at the Coast Guard office. Very kind, very organized. He handed me 3 pages and explained them very carefully. "Sarah, did you keep them?" Grace, "Yes." Sarah, did anyone ever explain why David was at the lighthouse before the storm warning was issued? The silence this time was different, shorter, harder. Grace said, "What lighthouse?" November 1998. David Okafor had driven 3 hours from Portland to stand on a lighthouse keeper's doorstep at 11 o'clock at night. He was not suicidal. The file, thin as it was, contained nothing to suggest it. He was a marine surveyor who had found something in the coastal survey data that he should not have found. And someone had told him that the lighthouse keeper was the right person to bring it to. Someone had sent him there. David Okafor had brought evidence, survey records, coastal mapping data, anomalies in the sea floor near the lighthouse, the kind of anomalies that accumulate when things are regularly deposited in deep water over a long period of time. He had brought it to Roy because someone told him Roy would know what to do with it. The someone who told him that Sarah didn't have that name yet. But she was beginning to understand that the fifth file wasn't thinner because less had happened. It was thinner because someone had worked very hard to make it that way. The county records office opened at 8. Sarah was there at 7:59. The coastal survey data from 1997 and 1998 was filed under routine environmental assessment, 46 folders. She needed one specific survey number, the number David Okafor had written in the margin of his own copy, now missing from the official file. She found the folder, opened it. The survey was there, the data was there. The anomaly David had marked was not. 3 pages had been removed. The staple holes in the corner still visible, neat, clean. Long ago, the pages were gone, but paper has memory. The sheet above the missing pages carried the ghost of whatever had been pressed against it, the faintest indentation of a pen moving across the pages below. Sarah photographed it, 6 angles, maximum contrast. Then she closed the folder, replaced it, signed out, walked to her car, sat for a moment, then drove directly to the one place she had been avoiding since she read her father's name on that file, the lighthouse. She had been to the cottage once, she had taken the logbook, she had photographed the tide chart, she had stood at the end of the jetty and felt the water below her and thought about her father. She had not gone back until now, because the logbook recorded what they told Roy, and the cottage, Roy's walls, Roy's maps, Roy's 30 years of solitude with a secret, might still hold what Roy told them, what Roy told her father. The last thing he heard before the water. The charts were a surface. 30 years of habit had taught her that the things people display are rarely the things they're hiding, but they are almost always placed in front of them. Behind the third chart, a column of numbers in pencil, 12 digits each, repeating format, survey grid coordinates, 6 of them. She photographed the wall, then stood back and counted. 5 disappearances, 6 coordinates. 1 coordinate had no corresponding entry in the logbook. Roy Calloway had lived here for 31 years. A man who records everything does not only record in books. The gap beneath the stove held a metal tin, flat, the kind that once held tobacco or biscuits, now holding neither. Sarah worked it free with 2 fingers, set it on the table, sat down, and opened it the way she had learned to open things that might not be reversible, slowly, and with her eyes already adjusted to the dark. The paper first, 1 sheet, folded twice, handwriting. Not Roy's measured script, something faster, pressured. The pen had gone through the paper in 2 places. It was a name and a phone number. The name was not Tom Briggs. The name was not David Okafor. It was a name Sarah didn't recognize. But beneath the name, written in Roy's hand this time, added later in different ink. He sent them all. I only received. Someone had been directing them to Roy. Not randomly, not by reputation alone, by design. Someone who knew which people were carrying information they shouldn't have. Survey data, financial records, witness accounts, and needed those people to find their own way to a place from which they would not return with an official record attached. Roy had not been a predator. Roy had been a disposal site. And somewhere along 30 years of receiving what was sent to him, he had decided that what came to his door was what the sea deserved. She climbed because she needed what Roy had every day for 31 years. The view, not the sea. She had looked at the sea from the jetty. She needed the altitude. The distance that turns a person into a figure, into a dot, into something the eye can watch without the heart intervening. She needed to understand what Roy saw when he watched them walk to the end of the jetty. Whether from up here it looked like choice or like something else. From up here, the jetty was nothing. A splinter, a scratch on the cliff's edge. And she understood something she could not have understood from below. Roy Calloway did not watch them die. Roy Calloway watched them disappear. There is a difference, and it is the difference that had let him sleep. From this height, in this light, a person walking to the end of the jetty becomes, at a certain point, simply gone. No moment, no transition, present, then not. Like a light switching off, clean, distant, nameless. The replaced plank near the end. She had seen it from below, registered it, moved past it. From up here, the contrast was clearer. New wood among old, replaced deliberately, carefully, not by Coast Guard maintenance. She had checked those records. Roy had replaced it himself. After November 1998, after David Okafor. Whether that was guilt taking care of evidence or something closer to a man tending a grave, Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass and could not decide. The plank was solid, well fitted. Whoever replaced it knew what they were doing. She pressed on it. No flex, no give. Roy had done this right. In 1998 or shortly after, in the weeks between her father's disappearance and Tom Briggs closing the file, Roy had come to this jetty and replaced one plank. She put her hand flat on the new wood, felt the cold of it, the grain of it, the fact of it. Her father had stood on this exact board. She was almost certain, and Roy had replaced it so that no one else would have to. The name came back with a result in 40 seconds. Regional Coastal Development Consultant, 1990 to 2003. Contracts with 3 county planning offices, including Depot Bay. Retired 2003. No criminal record. Currently, Lincoln City, Oregon, 40 minutes north. Sarah folded the paper, put it in her jacket pocket, started the engine. 5 people sent to a lighthouse. 1 man sent them. Roy received them. Tom Briggs closed the files. 3 points of a triangle that had held its shape for 30 years, and one of those points was still breathing. While Sarah drove north, Tom Briggs sat in his kitchen and thought about a phone call he had made in November 1998 and had not made since. He thought about whether a 27-year silence was the same as complicity, or whether there was a difference he could still argue for. He had almost decided when his phone lit up with an incoming call, not from Sarah, not from the name on his screen, from a number he hadn't seen in 27 years. He answered it. Martinfield. She said the name aloud in the car to hear what it sounded like without a file attached to it. A coastal development consultant who had held contracts with 3 county planning offices from 1990 to 2003. The same 13 years in which 5 people had been directed to a lighthouse and had not come back. She did not know yet what he had known. Whether he had known everything, or only enough to make each phone call and then turn away and not ask what happened next. Grace Okafor had kept everything. That was the thing Sarah had not known, had never thought to ask about, because asking would have meant acknowledging there was something that needed keeping. After Sarah's call the night before, Grace had gone to the hall closet and pulled down a box she had not opened since 2001. She was reading the Coast Guard report for the second time in her life when Sarah's car pulled up outside. Sarah had driven an hour to Portland before driving north to Lincoln City, an hour she didn't technically have. She needed to see her mother's face when she said what she'd found. Not because she needed confirmation, the files were the files, but because Grace Okafor had built 30 years of her life on a version of events that Sarah was about to revise. You don't do that by phone. Some things require being in the same room and being willing to stay in it after you've said them. Grace said, "There is a line on page 2. I read it in 2001 and I didn't understand it. I put it in the box because I didn't understand it, and I didn't want to understand it." Sarah looked at page 2, a reference, 1 line, to a witness statement collected at the scene. Witness, R. Calloway. Statement. The subject arrived at approximately 2300. We spoke briefly. He left of his own accord toward the water. Grace. Who is R. Calloway? Sarah looked up from the document. He's dead, she said. Grace nodded slowly, as if that was the only answer that had ever made sense. Sarah told her mother everything. Not the edited version, the detective's version. Controlled and sequential. Everything. The logbook. The 5 entries. Roy Calloway watching from the window. Tom Briggs arriving before the case was opened, the survey data, the missing pages, the tin beneath the stove, the name on the paper. Grace Okafor listened without interrupting once. When Sarah finished, Grace looked at the folded paper with Martin Field's name on it for a long time. Then she said, "Your father went there because someone told him he could trust the man at the lighthouse." A pause. "Who told him that?" "This man," Sarah said. "Martin Field. He held coastal development contracts in Depew Bay County during the same period. He knew the area. He knew Roy Calloway. He knew which people were carrying information about what was in the water near that lighthouse." Grace was quiet. "Then, David had found something in the survey data. He told me it was irregular. He said a colleague had suggested someone in the area could advise him, a man who knew the coast." "Sarah, did he tell you the colleague's name?" Grace looked at her daughter steadily. "Martin," she said. "He said the man's name was Martin." Martin Field had received a phone call 40 minutes ago. He had spoken for 3 minutes. He had said very little. He had listened, the way Roy Calloway had listened, but for different reasons. Roy listened because he cared about what was being said. Martin Field listened to calculate what was already known and what could still be managed. After the call, he had stood at this window for 30 minutes. The pleasant expression never left his face. It had nowhere else to go. It had been there too long to remember how to leave. She sat outside for 6 minutes. Not 4, like her mother's house. Not 22, like the parking lot. 6. Enough to run the geometry one more time. Martin Field sends David Okafor to Roy Calloway. Roy Calloway receives him. David Okafor does not leave the jetty. Tom Briggs closes the file in 9 days. And Martin Field retires in 2003. The same year, the last of the 5 disappears at the lighthouse. She got out of the car, walked to the door, rang the bell, and heard, from inside, the measured, unhurried footsteps of a man who was expecting her. He said, "Detective Okafor." Not a question. She said, "You know who I am." He said, "I was told to expect someone asking questions about an old matter." She said, "Who told you?" He smiled, the full weight of 30 years of practiced warmth, and stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I've been thinking about what I'm willing to tell you since before you rang the bell." She went inside. The door closed behind her. The porch light stayed on. The 2 chairs still facing the street, still not facing each other. He did not offer her the water. He had poured it for himself and left it on the desk and sat down without it, as if the gesture of preparation mattered more than the follow-through. Sarah looked at the closed folder on the desk. Martin Field did not look at it, which told her he was aware of it every second. "You said you've been thinking about what you're willing to tell me," she said. "Start with what you're not willing to tell me. It's usually faster." "I'm not willing," he said carefully, "to characterize my relationship with Roy Calloway as anything other than professional." "Sarah, you sent people to him." "Martin, I referred distressed individuals to someone I believed could offer counsel. Roy was unusual. People found him helpful." "Sarah, 5 of them found him so helpful they never came back." The pleasant expression held, just held, the way a structure holds under load. Not comfortably, but technically. "The survey data your father found," Martin said. Not a question, a placement, setting the subject on the table between them like a chess piece. "He came to me because we had worked in adjacent professional circles. He trusted my knowledge of the coast." "Sarah, he trusted you." Martin, "Yes, Sarah. And you sent him to Roy Calloway." A pause. Genuine this time. The first one that cost him something. "I thought Roy would listen to him, talk him through it, help him decide what to do with what he'd found." Sarah, "And what had he found?" The silence ran for 8 seconds. Sarah counted. "Illegal dumping," Martin said finally. "Industrial chemical waste, deposited in the coastal shelf north of the lighthouse over a period of approximately 6 years, beginning 1992. He looked up. "I was the consultant who signed off on the coastal survey that was supposed to detect it." Sarah said nothing. Martin Field looked at her with the eyes of a man delivering a weight he has carried for 27 years to the first person who has arrived with the right hands. 6 years of illegal dumping, a falsified coastal survey, a marine surveyor who found the anomaly in the real data, the data the falsified survey was designed to obscure. David Okafor had not gone to the lighthouse because he was broken. He had gone because a man he trusted had told him a lighthouse keeper would help him figure out what to do with evidence that could dismantle a 6-year criminal operation and the career of the man sitting across from his daughter 27 years later in a pressed cardigan with his hands folded in his lap. "You sent my father to Roy Calloway," Sarah said, knowing that Roy would listen to him, and knowing that Roy had a particular way of resolving what he heard. Martin Field said, "I did not know what Roy would do, Sarah. But you didn't call him the next day. You didn't ask how the conversation went. You didn't report David Okafor missing when he didn't contact you." Martin Field said nothing. "Sarah, you knew enough to do nothing, and doing nothing was the point." "I prepared this," he said, "after the call tonight. The one that told me someone was asking questions." Sarah looked at the folder. "What's in it?" Martin Field looked down at his own hands. "Everything I signed. Everything I falsified. The names of the companies who paid for the dumping. The dates. The coordinates." He looked up. "And a written account of every person I referred to, Roy Calloway. What they knew. Why I referred them." His hands did not shake. That was the thing. Sarah would remember later. His hands did not shake. She took the folder, did not open it, held it at her side. "You said you thought about what you were willing to tell me." Martin Field. "Yes." "Is this all of it?" A long pause. "It's all of what I can prove." Sarah. "And the rest?" He looked at the window, the back garden, the rectangular lawn going dark in the failing light outside. "The rest," he said quietly, "is that I have lived for 27 years with the knowledge of what Roy Calloway did with the people I sent him, and I never once picked up a phone." He did not say he was sorry. Sarah did not ask him to. She called her mother from the car. This time she didn't wait in the parking lot. Grace answered on the second ring. Sarah said, "I know what Dad found. I know why he went there. I know what happened." Grace Okafor said nothing for a long time. Then, was it his choice? At the end, was it his choice? Sarah looked at the folder, at the dates, at the coordinates of the dumping site her father had found in the survey data, the thing he had carried to a lighthouse on a November night in 1998. She said, "I don't know yet, Mom, but I'm going to find out." David Okafor had brought evidence to the only place he had been told was safe. He had trusted the man at the door. He had sat at the table. He had spread the papers out. And Roy Calloway, who had received 4 people before him and would receive 1 after, had listened. And then said something into the November dark of a cottage on a cliff above a 30-foot jetty. What he said was still not in the logbook. The logbook only recorded what they brought, not what Roy gave back in exchange. Sarah Okafor was going to find out what that was. One way or another, she had worked through the night. By 4 in the morning, the shape of it was clear. Not legally actionable yet, not with what she had, but clear in the way that a crime is clear before the law catches up to it. Martin Field had falsified environmental surveys. 6 companies had paid him to do it. 5 people had found out, or were about to find out, and had been redirected to a lighthouse on the Oregon coast, where a keeper waited, who believed the sea was the only honest listener. She had one move left before she could take this to the district attorney. She needed Tom Briggs to tell the truth on record. She called Tom Briggs at 7:15. He answered on the first ring. Either he had not slept, or he had been sitting beside the phone since the call from the unknown number the night before. Sarah said, "I have Martin Field's written account. I have the falsified surveys. I have the 5 case files. I need you to come in." A silence. Then Tom Briggs said, "I know." 2 words. The sound of a man who has been waiting for this specific sentence for 27 years and is relieved, genuinely, exhaustedly relieved, that it has finally arrived. He had driven himself, arrived 12 minutes early, was seated before Sarah entered the room. She set the recorder on the table, stated the date, the time, her name. Tom Briggs stated his name without being asked. The reflex of someone who has run this room from the other side for 20 years and knows exactly what the recorder requires. Then he looked at his hands and started at the beginning. Martin Field called me in 1991, said he had to contact Roy Calloway, who was good with distressed individuals, said he'd been sending people to him, people who were struggling. He made it sound like outreach, like Roy was a resource. Tom's hands tightened on the table edge. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked more questions. I was 34 years old, and Martin Field was a county contractor with 3 offices worth of relationships, and I was a new sheriff who wanted those relationships to stay intact. He stopped. That's not an excuse. That's what happened. The 5th one, your father. I knew it was different before I signed the form. Roy's statement had a gap in it. A gap I had learned by then not to pull on, because pulling on it meant pulling on everything before it. 4 cases I had already closed. 4 signatures already on forms. 4 decisions already made. He held her eyes. I signed it because the alternative was walking into everything I'd already done, and I wasn't. He stopped, started again. I wasn't brave enough. She asked him about the phone call from the night before, the unknown number. Tom said, Martin, Sarah. He called you, Tom, to tell me someone was asking questions, to ask me what I planned to do. Sarah, what did you tell him? Tom looked at the recorder, at its small red light. I told him I was going to tell the truth. A silence. He didn't say anything after that, just hung up. Sarah wrote 1 word on the legal pad, did not show it to Tom. The word was, finally. She crossed it out. It was not a professional notation. David Okafor had brought the evidence expecting a conversation about next steps, reporting channels, legal options, who to contact, how to stay safe while the information moved through the right hands. Roy Calloway had listened to all of it. And then, in the hours that followed, in the way that Roy Calloway spoke to people who came to his door, he had redirected the conversation, slowly, patiently, the way a current redirects, not against you, just around you, until you find yourself somewhere different from where you began. What Roy said, the thing the logbook never recorded, Sarah now believed she understood. Not threats, never threats. Roy Calloway was not a threatening man. He was a listening man who had learned, over 30 years, that what people carry can be made to feel heavier than it is, or lighter, depending on the frame you build around it. He told David Okafor the truth about what the evidence meant, who it would hurt, what it would cost, how long it would take, and what the sea looked like at low tide from the end of the jetty on a clear November night. He did not push. He described. After the interview, she drove to the lighthouse. She didn't plan to. She parked at the access road and walked the path in the dark, without the phone light, because Roy had walked it without one, and the people he guided here had walked it without one, and she wanted to know what it felt like to approach this place in only the light the lighthouse itself provided. She stood at the end. The beam passed over. The water below was black. Her father had stood here, on this wood, in this light, with Roy Calloway's words still in the air around him. She stood there for a long time. The beam kept turning. She put her hand on the wood and felt the cold of it and the grain of it and the fact of it, the same as before. The same thought. Her father had stood here. But this time, a different question came with it. Not, what did Roy say to him? She knew enough of that now. Not, was it his choice? That question was for the DA and the courts and whatever came next. The question that came in the dark at the end of the jetty with her hand on new wood and the beam turning above her was simpler and worse. Did he think of her? Before the water, did he think of her? The district attorney received Martin Field's folder at 9 o'clock that morning. By 11, 2 of the 6 companies named in the falsified surveys had already retained counsel. By afternoon, Martin Field had been asked to remain in Lincoln City pending formal inquiry. He had agreed, quietly, precisely, with the same controlled cooperation he had offered everything else in the 27 years since he had last made a phone call that changed the direction of a life. Sarah sat at her cleared desk and felt none of the things she had expected to feel. 5 disappearances, 3 decades, 1 man who listened, 1 man who directed, 1 man who signed, and a logbook left on a table by a dead keeper who had decided, at the end, that 30 years of carrying it was enough. Sarah looked at the board and thought about what justice looked like here. Martin Field would be charged. The environmental fraud alone would take years to litigate. Tom Briggs would testify. He had already started. Roy Calloway was dead, and her father was still in the water 40 feet off a cliff on the Oregon coast. Justice has a shape. It is rarely the shape you drew in your mind at the beginning. Tom Briggs' formal testimony took 4 hours and 11 minutes. He did not consult his lawyer once. He named every case, every date, every phone call from Martin Field, every visit to the lighthouse that preceded a case closure, every signature on every form. When it was over, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table and said one thing that was not part of the testimony. Off the record, the recorder already stopped. "I thought about your father every November 14th for 27 years. I don't expect that to mean anything to you. I just needed to say it." Sarah said nothing. She did not turn the recorder back on. Lily Calloway came on a Thursday, unannounced, the same as the first time. She stood in the doorway and said, "I read everything, the news coverage, the DA filing, Tom Briggs' statement." A pause. "I knew my grandfather was not an easy man. I did not know what kind of not easy." She looked at Sarah directly. "I'm not going to ask you to tell me he was good. I'm asking you to tell me, was any of it real? The listening. Did it help them before?" She stopped. Started again. "Did any of them feel less alone?" Sarah looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think they did. I think Roy Calloway was genuinely present for every person who came to his door. I think he listened in a way that very few people listen. Fully, without judgment, without impatience." Lily nodded once. Slowly, Sarah continued. "And then he used everything he'd heard to take them somewhere they might not have chosen on their own." Lily was quiet. "Both things are true," Sarah said. "I've stopped trying to make one of them cancel out the other." She looked at his photograph for a long time without speaking. Then, "He used to take me to the lighthouse when I was small. Let me watch the beam rotate. He said, 'The light doesn't care where it points, it just turns. The ships decide what to do with it.'" She looked back at Sarah. "I think he believed that. About himself. About everything." She stood, picked up her bag. "I'm sorry about your father." 3 words, plain and direct. No orchestration, no performance. Sarah said, "Thank you for bringing the logbook." Lily left, without looking at the corkboard again. Grace Okafor had been formally notified as next of kin that David Okafor's case had been reopened. She had received the notification by mail. The way these things arrive, in a plain envelope, at a Tuesday morning, alongside a water bill and a grocery circular. Sarah had driven to Portland before her mother could call. They sat with tea and said very little for a long time, which was, Sarah understood, exactly what was needed. Not information, not procedure, just the particular presence of someone who knows the full shape of a thing sitting beside someone who has just learned it. Grace said, "Do you think he knew, at the end, that it mattered? What he'd found, the survey data. Do you think he knew it would eventually—" She stopped, looked at the tea. "It took 27 years, Sarah said. Grace nodded. "He would have thought that was too long." A pause. "He was always impatient about the right things." She smiled. Small, private, the smile of a memory that belongs only to her, and looked at the wedding photograph. Sarah looked at it too. For the first time since she had been sitting in this room, she let herself look at it without the file attached. The cottage would be cataloged, the tide charts bagged and logged, the stove examined, the gap beneath it already photographed and documented. Roy Calloway's 31 years would be processed by people with gloves and labels and chain of custody forms. Sarah stood on the path and looked at the door and thought about a man who had spent 3 decades in this specific acre of the world, watching the beam turn, listening to people arrive, saying whatever it was he said, watching the jetty from the window, and had left finally, not a confession but a logbook, as if the distinction mattered to him. Perhaps it did. Perhaps that was the last and most honest thing about Roy Calloway. He knew exactly what he was doing. He just needed someone else to decide what to call it. She did not walk to the end. She had stood there twice. She did not need a third time. She stood at the entrance with one hand on the post and looked down the 40 feet of rotting wood to the open water, and said her father's name once, quietly, into the sound of the sea. Not for the case. Not for the record, not for Tom Briggs or Martin Field or the DA's office or the logbook or anything that had a procedure attached to it, just for him. Just because he had stood here, and no one had said his name into this specific air since November 1998, the beam passed over. The water did not answer. It never does. That is not what water is for. The case of David Okafor remained technically open pending the full environmental inquiry, which would take, the DA estimated, between 2 and 4 years. Martin Field would not see a prison cell. His lawyers were very good, and he was 71 years old. And the charges, though serious, were primarily financial. Tom Briggs lost his pension. Roy Calloway's death certificate listed natural causes. It still does. And the lighthouse beam continued to turn. Because it was automated now. Because automation does not require a keeper. Because the light does not need to know what it illuminates in order to illuminate it. Sarah Okafor drove south. The beam turned once behind her. Then again. Then the fog came in, and there was nothing to show it had ever been there. At all. Except the ships that had already passed, and the ones still finding their way in the dark.